All right, so we're gonna begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Alberto Cifuentes Jr. I'm part of the Macro Social Work Student Network, and I'm joined with my colleague, Tamari Willis. Tamari, do you wanna introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. So my name is Tamara Willis. I'm from Wayne State University in the city of Detroit. I was here assisting Alberta today with this amazing seminar.
Thank you, Tamari. I have the pleasure of working with her on this wonderful macro social work student network. She helped me organize this. And I want to also thank Becky Sander, who unfortunately can't be here, maybe probably till a little bit later. But Becky Sander is also part of our steering committee and offers us a lot of guidance and support. So I'm really happy to be talking with you about the skills needed to become a macro practitioner. And I'm joined by 4 really awesome, experienced macro practitioners that we'll get to know more in a little while. But just a little introduction to the Macro Social Work Student Network. If you haven't heard of us, or MSWSN, we're here to promote the visibility of macro practice, getting students engaged, helping chapters that are held in different universities. There's one at Florida State University, for instance, macro student social work student chapters, offering them resources. So we do a lot to increase visibility and education and awareness of macro practice in schools. And we also try to prepare for the next generation of macro practitioners. Hopefully you're one of those. So, and we're part of ACOSA, the Association for Community Organization and Social Action. So we're part of that larger organization. I encourage you to go to our website, acosa.org, and there's actually a link to the MSWSN there. So I'm gonna first just give you a little intro, since I'm not sure about people's experience level or knowledge base. I'm gonna give you all a little PowerPoint presentation that you're all gonna have a copy of. It's gonna be available on the website. And if you have any questions whatsoever while I'm doing my presentation, please put them in the chat. Tamari is monitoring the chat, so please put them in the chat. Also, if you run into any technical issues, please put them in the chat, and Tamari will help you to the best of her ability. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right. So this is developing your macro skills, tools and tricks for social work practitioners and students. And I'm not the only one doing this. I have 4 other, I couldn't do this alone. I have 4 other great macro practitioners who are joining me to try to explain how they got involved in macro practice, what are some skills they picked up, what are some pearls of wisdom that they can give. Let's go to the next slide. So, I went too far. So first, I'm going to talk about what macro social work is, talk about the difference between micro and macro, although they're very interrelated and interdependent. The 3 main branches of macro social work and macro career paths. Why is macro social work important? Although if you didn't know why it was, if you didn't know that it was important, then you wouldn't be here. So you kind of already know. We're going to do a panel discussion. Instead of breakout sessions, we might just do an open Q&A through the chat, and anyone who wants to unmute themselves and just talk and ask questions directly to our wonderful panelists. And then we're going to have a wrap up. So what is macro social work? Well, macro social work focuses on the larger scale social problems. So social problems, these don't just involve individuals or small groups. They involve communities, organizations, structural, systemic, institutional issues, and social problems such as poverty, homelessness, systemic racism, mass incarceration, and climate change, just to name a few. Macro social work centers in the development and implementation of social interventions that aim to affect positive changes, again, at these larger, broader levels, at the community, state, and national level. And this is just a really good way to kind of know, like, what's the difference between micro and macro? It even goes into mezzo, which is sort of, sometimes it gets put into macro, but think of micro as those individuals, those families, those relationships, those smaller target systems, and think of macro as those larger target systems of not only communities and organizations, but policies, cultures, and laws and pieces of legislation. That's the macro. But that's all needed, as this chart says, to dismantle stereotypes, to dismantle oppression. And for our first community organization, it's devoted to restoring democracy at the grassroots level and energizing citizens to become more active members of their society. So I have my specialization in community organization, and I got involved with community organization because I knew it was the first step to really effecting change in my community. Community organization focuses on fixing broken social systems, bringing about meaningful change to people's lives, and empowering vulnerable or oppressed populations. Often these are hard to reach populations, marginalized communities that are often invisible from the media. They're underrepresented in a lot of research and a lot of policy. And community organizing unites local citizens or residents around a common concern, ranging from preventing crime, reducing toxic waste, fighting prejudice, and creating community building projects. So there are many uses of community organization. And here's some of the possible career paths. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list, so don't think these are the only careers, but just some possible career paths include community activist, community development coordinator, a program planner, coalition builder, field organizer, and union organizer. And now on to policy practice, which encompasses the professional efforts to influence the development, enactment, implementation, modification, or assessment, or sometimes all of those, of public and social policies. And the goal is to primarily ensure social justice and equal access to basic social goods on a local, state, and or federal level. So the policy practice that I do, which is more research-based, I do it along the lines of, I want to ensure equity. I want to ensure that people have equal access to resources. It often involves policy analysis, creating, disseminating policy briefs. I've done those before. Those are really helpful when you're communicating with legislators. Policy briefs are really useful. Analyzing, developing budgets, social media communications, running political campaigns. So there is such a field as political social work, which has a lot to do with running political campaigns, running for office, or even managing a campaign. And policy practice can also involve grant proposal writing and, of course, lobbying. And these are just, again, not an exhaustive list of career paths that policy practitioners can take, including political social worker, like I was saying before, a campaign organizer or manager, a lobbyist, a grant writer, or even a policy analyst or advocate. I tend to go more for on the policy advocacy side, but I know other people who do more the nitty gritty policy analysis, which is really important to policy practice and to improving a lot of health outcomes for marginalized populations. And lastly, our third main level of macro practice, of course, there's more, but these are the three main community organizing policy practice and social work administration. So social work administration often serves, these administrators often serve as decision makers, supervisors, or regulators. Community organizers and policy practitioners can also serve as those. So don't think that these are all exclusive, that sometimes there's overlap between a lot of these positions. Social work administrators often are concerned about the well-being of the total system related to their agency or organization in relation to social service delivery or delivering a program or service. And it's often rooted in the commitment to being consumer-oriented, so being client-focused, and serving disenfranchised or marginalized populations. Again, that's something that all of the strands of macro practice do. And just some, but not all, of the career paths include being a manager, a program manager, an executive director, program planner, a supervisor, or a grants and funded research director. So any kind of administrative leadership position often accounts for this career path. And if you're wondering by now if macro practice, why it's so important, I'm gonna let Dr. Michael Reich do the talking here, because in his Why Macro Practice Matters, which when you get a copy of this, you'll be able to link to his short paper on why macropractice matters. He states that macropractice is needed for that critical and transformational lens to realize the goal of social justice. Macropractice really does give you that, that big picture lens, and that way to look at something from a transformative view, from a critical view, to I sort of liken it to the sociological imagination, to thinking what we can do to be innovative. Often social entrepreneurship falls into this category too. So I think all of that is enhanced by macropractice. Reich states that it pushes the boundaries of the profession by fostering big picture perspective, analyzing people's issues outside of the box, and focusing on the prevention of problems, not merely their amelioration. I think we do so much work on care and treatment, which is important. And we, when something happens, we react to it, but we don't do enough to prevent it. And macropractice is often focused on how can we prevent these wicked problems of climate injustice or systemic racism. And lastly, throughout the history of the profession, macro practitioners have been the leaders in translating the social work profession's ethical imperative of social justice into practice. So often macro practice is kind of marginalized in the field of social work. There's a lot in schools, you often get either a generalist or clinical perspective. You don't get that macro practice perspective. And so that's why one of the reasons ACOSA exists and the Macro Social Work Network exists, to realize that macro practice shouldn't be siloed, it should be integrated, and we should all be able to talk about it and have these skills. Which brings me to some of the most skilled people I know. I'm so excited to introduce our panel. Our first panelist, Marianne Kiefer, who is an Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Coalition for Behavioral Health. Sarah Holroyd, who's the Director of Mental Health and Addiction Services for the iCare Health Network. Precious Price, who's the Director and Community Organizer at the Middletown Racial Justice Coalition. And Gus Marks Hamilton, who's the Smart Justice Field Organizer at the American Civil Liberties Union of Connecticut, ACLU Connecticut. They're going to tell you a lot more about themselves when we do the panelists. So let me just shift gears now. Okay. Give me 1 second. Am I still sharing the screen? Okay, I figured that. Let me try to get it changed. Hold on 1 second. There it is. Okay. All right. Thank you. It was hiding. So, okay. So let's begin with each panelist. So we'll start. I'm going to start with who I see right next to me, which is Sarah. So Sarah, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself again and letting us tell us a little bit more about your job in your career and maybe a fun fact about yourself. So we'll just go down. So we'll just reintroduce yourself. What is your job and a fun fact about yourself.
Okay, there was a technical difficulty and it paused. So all I heard was job. Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you. I'm sorry. My introduction's been a little bit wonky. So just reintroduce yourself, your title, a little bit about your job, and a fun fact about yourself.
Okay, terrific. Well, thanks so much for having me here today, Alberto. My name is Sarah Holroyd, and I am the Director of Mental Health and Addiction Services at the iCare Health Network. We serve a 98% Medicaid population in long-term care and a very large percentage of people who need skilled nursing care as a result of their addictions. And I also am the co-founder and president of the Manchester Hope Initiative, which is an opioid diversion program for people who are struggling with opioid use disorder, and a partnership program that diverts opioid users to treatment instead of jail. I received my my MSW from UConn in admin. And a fun fact about me is that I am ambidextrous. My fine motor skills are lefty, but my gross motor skills are righty. So I played sports righty, but I eat and I write lefty. Kind of quirky, but
Interesting. I wish I could be even quasi ambidextrous. I really do. That's great. All right, Precious.
Hey everyone, I'm so excited to be here. Good afternoon. My name is Precious. I am the director of the Middletown Racial Justice Coalition. If there's any Middletown folks in the room, woo-hoo. So what we do there is I work with different systems to look at their policies, their practices, their procedures, of just looking at how they can be better anti-racist organizations and humans. We also do a lot of organizing work. One of the really cool things that we did this summer was we had our school, we fought really hard, and you would not believe how hard it was to change the school name, but we have a new middle school being built in Middletown, and we got the name changed. We organized to get the name changed from Woodrow Wilson Middle School to Beeman Middle School, who was a Black abolitionist in Middletown, who founded a lot of stuff that most folks don't know about. And so, we do organizing work, we do individual sessions with folks around race and people on a racial justice journey, who are learning about themselves, learning about their communities. And a fun fact about me is that I cannot go to sleep without having a jam session every night. So like I jam out for hours before I go to sleep to just music.
Very cool. Thank you, Precious. All right, Miriam.
Hi, thank you, Alberto, and thank you all for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Miriam Kiefer. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Coalition for Behavioral Health. The coalition represents about 100 social service, mental health, and substance use organizations in the New York City, Long Island, and Westchester areas. And we provide policy advocacy training and technical assistance to our member organizations. So in my role, I work on all of our legislative and regulatory advocacy, mostly focused around Medicaid and Medicaid managed care, since our member agencies serve the Medicaid, those with Medicaid health insurance. We also interact with the New York State legislature and New York City Council as well. A fun fact about me, I greatly enjoy baking. And during, all of this staying at home, I have learned how to bake sourdough bread from scratch with a starter, just from flour and water. So that's something that I've been enjoying a lot.
Cool. I will say baking can be very therapeutic. So I do. That's a great point, Miriam. All right. Last but not least, Gus.
Hi there. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gus Marks Hamilton. I am a field organizer with the ACLU of Connecticut's Smart Justice Campaign, and my primary role is to mobilize, educate, and build support for our campaign at sort of the legislative level in Hartford, where our state capital is. A lot of the work that I do is meeting with people, doing one-on-ones, and then sort of bringing them into their campaign and asking them to step into their role to end mass incarceration. The mission of the Smart Justice Campaign in Connecticut is to end mass incarceration and eliminate the racism that exists in Connecticut's criminal legal system. We officially launched in 2018, which is when I became a part of the campaign. That was during a governor's race here in Connecticut. And now we do a lot of legislative work in addition to the electoral work that we initially did at the beginning of the campaign. I feel like there's so much that I can talk about, but effectively our work has been shut down because of COVID, because when COVID arrived in Connecticut in March, we were doing a lot of lobbying at the Capitol, and you can't do that during a pandemic because everything was shut down. The legislative session was shut down. It was initially suspended, and then it was finally just ended altogether. So over the last 7 or 8 months, we've been sort of going back to our roots in terms of building the campaign, doing a lot of outreach, meeting even more people, inviting them to step into their role to end mass incarceration in Connecticut. We believe very strongly that every single person in the state of Connecticut, whoever they are, whatever their connection to the criminal legal system, in some way they can play a role in ending mass incarceration and the racism within the criminal legal system. So I graduated from the University of Connecticut, the School of Social Work in 2017. I was a policy practice student there, and I'm also a licensed master social worker here in Connecticut. And a fun fact about me is I've been trying to adopt a dog for the past 6 months, but apparently dog adoption during a pandemic has been incredibly popular. So I've been like very frustrated because every time I find a dog, I contact the adoption agency, I go through the application. Applications for pet adoption are extremely rigorous. Like I was shocked at like how people want to look at my Facebook profile. They want to contact 3 different personal references. Like it's harder to get a job than it's harder to adopt a dog than it is to get a job. But I finally connected with an agency last week and found a dog that's down in Texas. So I'm hoping that that dog will get up to me sometime after Thanksgiving. So I'm excited to be a pet owner for the first time.
Well, good luck, Gus. I'm sure that dog will be very happy when he arrives at your home. So, or she arrives at your home. So let's begin talking about. So there are a lot of students in this meeting, and let's talk about like your education. Let's talk about like the skills. Were you able to specialize in macro practice when you were in school? Or how did you get those skills while you were still, getting your MSW? How did you get those skills in macro practice? Anyone can start.
I can start. So I got my MSW from the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College. And so at Hunter, there's a specific community organization specialization. And then also you can get a certificate in policy analysis. So that is what I did. When I was at Hunter, I also made sure that my internships gave me some exposure to policy, whether it be interaction with regulation. So reviewing regulations at the city, state, federal, or international level. My second year field placement was at an international organization. So I looked at a variety of United Nations regulations, other country regulations, just getting that practice of becoming comfortable with reading laws and regulations, and then thinking about how that impacts the community or clients that you're working with at your field placement. That really helped me gain and learn those skills and hone those skills while I was in school. And then when I graduated, I actually worked in direct service for a while after I graduated, which is something that some macro practitioners might experience, but that actually really helped me because I was able to kind of thinking about when I work directly with clients, what are some of the regulations and laws that are impacting them in their lives, and how I could, in my role, even as a direct practitioner, advocate kind of at a larger level, either within my organization or partnering with other organizations.
Great.
I would second that internships for me were, I'll jump in front of you, Precious. All right. Yeah, I'll second and say that internships for me were incredibly important. I got to intern in a United States Senator's office, and I also got to intern in the Connecticut Sentencing Commission, which gave me a really upfront look at the development of policies that affected the criminal legal system. But in addition to that, like Marianne was talking about, the ability to be able to see sort of the sausage making of laws and policies up front, building relationships with the people you have opportunities to meet in your internships was incredibly important for me, especially in the world of doing lobbying and political stuff. Relationships are incredibly important, as they are at the micro level, but at the macro level too. Building relationships with folks is incredibly important, especially when I was at the Sentencing Commission. That was a body that's made up of 20 practitioners that are police chiefs, defense attorneys, prosecutors, policymakers in Connecticut, and being able to not only know who they are, but have them recognize me has been incredibly useful in sort of the beginning of my career. And then also at UConn, UConn has something called the campaign school that they do every year. I don't know if that goes on the road at all, but the campaign school was really useful too, because even though I'm not particularly interested in running for an elected office myself, I've done a lot of working on political campaigns, door knocking, phone calls, those types of things. And when you have opportunities to meet with candidates, whether they're running for the first time or they've been running for elections for their entire career, getting that face time with elected officials can be incredibly useful for you, not only from a career standpoint, but just in terms of trying to advocate for the policies that you're supporting. So if you have opportunities to get involved in political campaigns at like the municipal level, city council, at the statewide level, I would highly encourage students to get involved in those things.
I think the campaign school is going virtual next year. So this might be a good opportunity for those people who are out of state, who are not in Connecticut, although a lot of people come from outside of Connecticut to the campaign school to do it. So if you look up Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work Campaign School, you'll find more information. So thank you. Precious, did you want to go?
Sure. So when I was, in grad school at the University of Connecticut, I actually started in micro practice. I came in casework and realized that with my degree in psychology, I was bored. I was learning the same things. I didn't feel like I was growing as a social worker. And I didn't feel like we were really talking about the issues. And so I started hanging out with like amazing folks like Alberto and some other folks at the School of Social Work, and just got involved in everything that I could possibly get involved with, to the point to where my professors actually thought I was a macro student and actually didn't know that I was even a micro student. And so when they found out, I had a couple of professors who were, like, you should transition, and this would be a very easy transition for you. And I didn't know much about macro practice, to be honest. And so I transitioned and never looked back. Like, it was such a different experience. And so as far as trying out other types of macro practice, when I graduated, I had the amazing opportunity to intern both in Washington, D.C., both for a senator, Connecticut Senator Murphy. And then I also got to intern, I grew up in foster care, so I got to intern at the largest think tank for foster care in America, which is, I forgot the name of the one. It's really long, I'm sorry. It's for adoption, and yeah, I am messing that up, so I'm just gonna stop. But I got to intern at both of these organizations at the same time. And I don't know how people work in policy. To the folks up here that are policy practice, like, y'all the real MVPs. Like, I take all of the hats off to you, because working in Capitol Hill was terrible. I was like, this ain't for me. But, I see the importance of working with policy as a community organizer, coming back here, working, my first job was strictly community organizing for the north end of Middletown, and doing neighborhood organizing. And it was nothing but working with both individuals all the way up to working with policy. And so I discovered like a love of both a little bit. And so I don't really consider community organizing to be macro. I consider it to be meso, because I do work with individuals, and then I do work with systems and policy. So that's just my take on it.
Thanks, Precious.
So for me, I would definitely say that I recollect, so I received my BSW from Wheelock College, which is now Boston University. It was bought out by BU a couple of years ago or last year. And I remember being at the Boston State House and learning, there was a class, and it was just the class in the Boston State House, and really like feeling in my blood and my bones, like seeing macro work up close. And I was like, this is for me. As Precious said, respectfully, I was a little bit bored by some of the micro work. I also did some direct care, and still continue to have a small private practice a therapy service that I do on Sunday afternoons, but it's different. I have a lot more control over who and what I'm working with, and I focus only on addictions related cases, which is my area of expertise. But for me, my heart and soul, the second I learned that you have the possibility to change entire systems and laws and turn things like upside down on its face and have the potential to impact large swaths of people opposed to just one, it felt really meaningful to my heart and soul. And so for me, I just knew I was going to be a macro person from a very young age. And so a lot of my work and skills, UConn was really helpful as far as helping to shape, some of my leadership abilities. I took an accounting class with them, which was brutal, but I'm glad I did it. And I had quite a bit of exposure to policy and exposure to not quite lobbying, but relationships with politicians and things of that nature. And for me, I felt like it was really important to start my nonprofit, and I somehow convinced UConn to let me do my internship hours on the HOPE initiative at the Manchester Police Department, and I was really empowered to hone and build up my macro skills as a result of my internship, and it kind of just grew over time. But I was really able to do some really amazing things, like get our 501c3 status by myself and things like that. But for me, I've learned in social work that macro work especially, but all social work is about what you're passionate about. Even though all social workers are passionate about helping people, for me, my niche was really addictions and mental health, and it lit another fire in me that, made it almost easy. So, but I knew immediately when I learned the difference between micro, meso, and macro, I was like, oh, that's definitely me. I'm definitely a macro social worker.
Cool. So, well, you've definitely given me some food for thought as to what is necessary as part of your education. And I think what's important to note is that some of you did get your starts in direct service or have experience with direct service, but you shifted to macro, and that's totally fine. And that you can still do that within your schooling, within your, even within your career, you can still do that. So I think that's important to note. What do you think in terms of your careers now? What do you think are some of the most important macro skills that allow you to do your work effectively, so that allow you to succeed in what you're doing? What are some of the skills that you've honed or you've developed throughout your years as a macro practitioner? Anyone can start.
So I think a skill that I had from a very young age is, especially growing up in foster care, is like learning how to speak up, learning how to advocate both, from the start for myself, and then for others. And so always having that passion and that belief of a strong belief of like, this is not right. This is not how you treat people. And it started there. And I wouldn't say that's a skill. I would just say that's something that, I think most people have, empathy and compassion. But as far as, skills, I've always been someone who's found really interesting and creative ways to advocate. I've advocated through dance, through poetry, through music, through art. I've advocated through talking shit. Showing up at legislative offices and, cussing people out if I needed to. And in the work that I do, talking about race all day long, was the largest skill that I've, acquired that helps me to do my work is like learning how to set boundaries and take care of myself. As a Black woman, this is the hardest thing I could have ever done. And that is probably the greatest skill that I'm still working on. And I know there's a question about self-care, so I'll just stop there.
I'm going to go off what Precious was saying and say that self-care is definitely a journey, but I know there's a question later for it, but it's the process. I spoke to one of Alberto's classes about a month ago, and we had a talk about how in school you hear so much about self-care and the importance of it, but that in actuality, for most of us, it is a lifelong learning curve and tough, especially when you're passionate about something. So as far as the skills, I also second Precious's notion of being a fierce advocate and outspoken, maybe even at times when it was uncomfortable. I think for me, it also was that, and being bold and fierce, and in many ways feeling like I was fighting for people and groups that were being bullied by a larger collective society. And once I really started learning in school and educating myself more so about with actually understanding systems of race and oppression and how deeply rooted it was, I better understood the importance of all of us being outspoken about those things. I think in my own work, relationship building has been a really big one. I think Gus briefly mentioned this as well, but just getting to know all different kinds of people and all different kinds of roles and all different kinds of places. And, I'm someone who's really outgoing, but, I could call on, I'm sure, anyone on this panel at any time, to open a connection or a door if they had that connection or door, and just kind of knowing how to do that and have meaningful relationships and to network. Social services is not that big of a profession, in Connecticut, where I am, is not that large. But I think compassion is a big one. And I also think for me, servant leadership is really big. I think when I graduated my MSW, they gave us a speech about how when a lot of people graduate with their MSW, they will be a social worker, but then become something else. So like they'll become an administrator or director, and they stop saying they're a social worker. So I always took that to heart. And everywhere I go, I'm like, I am a social worker. And I really have tried to always make sure that I blend that into everything I'm doing, leadership or otherwise, and that I'm taking like a fair and comprehensive and empathetic approach to everything that I do. So even though I'm in leadership, I'm still using a lot of the like micro social work type skills, but on a larger scale. And I love what I do, and it fits my personality well, and I'm grateful. But I definitely think being fiercely outspoken, relationship building, and servant leadership, I would say, are the three biggest skills that I've had to hone and or craft over the years.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I would second what Sarah and Precious had mentioned. Networking is so incredibly important in macro practice, not only in terms of when you're working on a campaign or an advocacy initiative, but also just in your own professional development. Since I've graduated from my MSW program, all of the subsequent jobs I've gotten since have been through networking, and so that's another, it's advocating for yourself and also advocating for a community. So keeping in contact with people and thinking about ways how you want to keep in contact with people, whether it just be when you meet with a legislator or their staff, sending a thank you email after that meeting. Or linking them on LinkedIn, really important. It was something that I had to really learn how to do and just remind myself to do that. One other thing I wanted to mention that hasn't been talked about yet, and especially if you're doing regulatory reform or advocacy or legislative advocacy, writing and learning how to write for different audiences is incredibly important. So the way you write to a community is going to be very different than the way you write to a legislator or to a regulator. And so just making sure that your tone and what you're talking about is appropriate for that audience. So if I'm talking with a legislator about Medicaid and how certain mental health services are very difficult to access, I'm probably not going to use a lot of technical clinical language because I'm going to lose that person in a minute, and my advocacy isn't going to be as effective as it can be. So, kind of boiling it down, making it really clear, or tying it back to their constituency, like X amount of people in your district are on waiting lists for mental health services. Making sure that that message is really clear so your advocacy is effective.
Thank you. I always emphasize that to my students, writing, and the importance of being a good writer. So,
gets you really far. When
It
people really notice your writing skills, it gets you very, very far.
couldn't agree more. How about you, Gus?
I don't want to just be repetitive with what other people said, though, but I will add that networking is, especially during a pandemic when everyone is quarantined, a lot of the work I do is going to events where you have opportunities to just by chance run into people. So it's a lot harder to build relationships with people when you're quarantined in your house or your apartment. And Zoom meetings are not effective at doing that either. Zoom meetings are great for these types of meetings, if you have a panel of people that you're trying to hook up with, but in those like informal opportunities when you're in a hallway with somebody or standing outside and standing in line for food or something like that, those opportunities just don't exist the way they did prior to COVID. And then for me, like I was a policy student when I was going for my graduate degree. And I do organizing work right now. And I don't anticipate doing organizing work for the rest of my career. I work in sort of a grant funded position right now. So I realized that at some point I'll be transitioning to some other type of area. It could be within this organization, it could be elsewhere. So you have to be flexible in terms of where you think your career can go and pick up skills where you can. I started off my job here part-time. I was working 15 hours a week, and then eventually it became 25 hours a week. And now I have a full-time position though, but I had to have the willingness and the dedication to let that happen and also make myself valuable over time, because it took about a year from me being a part-time employee to becoming a full-time employee. So having some patience and believing that, you know, with the work and everything, you'll get that done. And at the same time, like everyone has said, it's about building relationships. I have a spreadsheet of contacts that I try to go through every once in a while. And I used to really update it all the time so I could see who I was keeping in contact with. I've gotten a little rusty at that, but since the summer ended, I've tried to get back into that and looking at folks who I haven't talked to since March or prior to the COVID, and just doing basic check-ins with them. Sometimes there's opportunities there to kind of deepen a relationship or develop some sort of professional opportunity. And then, you know, if you're just talking from a sort of a humanity, just being able to build with people and keep in touch with them, you never know when something down the line might become an opportunity. So maintaining your relationships is very important.
So,
Alberto,
go ahead.
Is there another question about networking?
No, but you know what? Let's talk about let's talk about networking. No, networking is really important. I think we should talk about that. Actually, did you want to say something about it?
Yeah,
or go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a comment in case we weren't going to come back to it. I would have waited. When it comes to that idea of building relationships, something that is extremely helpful for me is that I don't believe in human hierarchy. What that means is that I am not afraid to approach people. I am not afraid to talk to people. I am not afraid to reach out. Like when I was on Capitol Hill, folks were like, how did you get lunch with this senator? How did you get to meet with this congressperson? And I was like, I emailed them and they were like, they never meet with interns. I said, they met with this intern. And I've never been afraid to approach people. And so building relationships because of that mentality, like I treat people how, you know, they treat me. And I don't necessarily see this person as untouchable because of a title that they hold. And so I use that ideology to not be afraid of talking to folks. And I'm telling you right now, politics in general just love to talk about themselves. And so I was, meeting with folks left and right. I was getting job offers in DC and all types of other things. And so networking is super important. So if there's a job you want, something that you're looking at, an internship, and you know who that person is, invite them to coffee, have a conversation with them, send them an email, and don't be afraid to reach out to folks. So that's just what I want.
So I think building, go ahead, Miriam, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to second what Precious had mentioned. Never be afraid to introduce yourself. In in places I've worked at, sometimes, when you're onboarded, your supervisor or your internship supervisor might not introduce you to people or introduce you to everyone, but don't let that hold you back. And it can be intimidating, but when you see people in the hallway or in the elevator, introduce yourself, because you never know where that's going to get you and where that network is going to take you. And there's also, I saw a question in the chat about how do we network in a virtual space. So right now is a great opportunity. You're interacting with new people. You can shoot a private message to someone that you might want to talk to, send people an email. Is another way. Setting up informational interviews, as Precious said, people love to talk about themselves. So informational interviews is another great way to network. I also will sometimes do what I call a LinkedIn deep dive, which is where I'll look for people on LinkedIn who might have the career or be working at the organization that I want to work at 5-10 years from now, and just send them a LinkedIn message and just say, hey, I'm really interested. I'd like to hear more. Like, do you have time to, email or set up a time to talk? And the worst thing that can happen is they don't respond. And the best thing that they can happen is they do respond. And now you have somebody in your network and somebody to advocate for you.
It's great
If I could
advice.
just add to that, I just put my phone number and my email address in the chat. So if anybody's here in Connecticut and you guys are interested in doing lobbying advocacy work, marching with us, hopefully when we do get a chance to march together, I'd love to hear from you guys. And like I do a lot of screenshots when I'm in Zoom meetings and it's a large panel of people and I'm just one of the participants. Like I will take a screenshot, I'll take my phone out and I'll take a shot of that, and then I'll look those people up. Like I'm not afraid to like look somebody up on Facebook or look somebody up on LinkedIn or whatever, and try to connect with them that way. So you got to use the tools that you have that are available to you too. So again, if anybody here is in Connecticut and they want to reach out and do lobbying work to end mass incarceration in Connecticut, I'd love to hear from you.
So it's really clear that building relationships is really important, and there are numerous ways you can do that. But doing it during COVID-19 makes it so much and exponentially more difficult. So what are your tips for being able to build those relationships that you talk about and network during COVID-19, like during this COVID era? Like, what are your best tips and tricks for doing that?
Like my primary job responsibility is to grow and mobilize the Smart Justice campaign. So what I used to do pre-COVID was you'd meet somebody, you'd set up a date to have coffee, and then I would typically drive out to wherever they are, because if I invest, time to drive an hour and a half to meet somebody, to have coffee with them, to chat about, whatever they're interested in, and then relating that back to the work that I do, and then inviting them to drive 90 minutes to come do lobbying for an afternoon for us in the Capitol. Luckily, I don't have to worry about driving anymore. So Zoom makes that a lot easier, just in terms of you don't have to worry about like the kind of like basic stuff of having to meet somebody where they're at. But at the same time, there's a separation that Zoom makes things less intimate, and not being able to share space with somebody creates a distance that can be a bit of a hurdle to overcome. So for me, it's a lot of follow-ups. So maybe you get a chance to have a phone conversation with somebody. A lot of times I'll get a spreadsheet with a whole bunch of people that are interested in doing volunteer opportunities with the ACLU. So I will go through that list and I'll call everybody first. The folks that I don't get to talk to on the phone, if I just left them a message, they get an email. And then a couple of days later, I'll go through that list again and do another round of phone calls. Then it's a Zoom meeting after that, so we can get sort of some FaceTime with each other. And then if that goes really well, and I think this person looks like really promising as a supporter, as a volunteer, it's a week later, just peppering them with text messages, email updates on the work that we're doing. If there is an action that's coming up, I want to make sure everybody gets invited to that. And for me, that's creating a spreadsheet where I have, the person's name, their contact information, and then I have all sorts of different columns with dates on them when I touched them up, whether it's a text message, an email, a phone call, when I saw them in person somewhere at some sort of an action. It's maintaining that contact with people because, again, when we're all quarantined like this, the opportunities to see people are pretty limited. So you want to make sure you're keeping track of your contacts. And if you haven't talked to somebody in a couple of weeks, send them a text message, make a phone call. Just it doesn't have to be a long phone call. You can just say, hey, I got 15 minutes right now, but I just wanted to touch base with you, see how you're doing. And, hopefully we have a thing coming up next week. Did you hear about the Zoom panel that's meeting on Friday? It'd be awesome if I could see you there, but I just thought of you when I saw it, something like that.
Great.
What I find works for me during this time is just not wasting people's time, just being very direct, and saying like, hey, I saw you at this thing. I think you were dope. Do you have 15 minutes to have a conversation about something that I heard you say? I want to learn more about that. I try to be as detailed as possible because it is another Zoom meeting. Nobody wants to sit on another Zoom meeting, even to meet wonderful folks. Like, it's just not fun. So I think when folks have been very direct about, wanting to meet, they saw me at something or we met at something before COVID and they just want to catch up. That's been something that will make me respond, is that I'm just like, okay, I'm cool with that. Like, that sounds great. And I've been quicker since COVID actually to respond to folks than I was when I was out organizing. So that's just different. That may be different for me as someone who works in the streets a lot.
So I think at this point, I'm not going to go into breakout rooms, because if we go into breakout rooms, then I won't be able to record it. And I have several other questions, but I also wanted to open it up to our participants. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will address them directly. But since no one has any questions right now, I'm going to keep going and I'm going to keep asking some questions, and hopefully there'll be some questions that participants have in mind. So my next question has to do with how you got your specific job, because you had to use certain skills in order to get that job. And some of which we mentioned: networking, building relationships, being flexible. So if each of you could just, talk about how you got your specific job, what skills you used to get that specific job that you have right now.
I can go. So I always laugh with this story because I always preface it by saying this doesn't really happen in real life. But so with my work with the Hope Initiative, I was in the media a lot. I still run Hope in a 100% volunteer capacity. And I shared a lot of my own personal story of being in recovery from addiction. And I was very brutally honest about that. And I didn't blink or balk at any of that. And I just held my head high. And so my present boss, the COO of our company, reached out to me on LinkedIn about 3 years ago and was like, hey, would you ever consider coming to consult for our company? We would love to have you on board and tap into your substance use disorder expertise. And so I started consulting for them. And then after they got to know me a little bit better, I hustled really hard. I did a really good job. I try and have a really high level of excellence with everything I do. But as they were getting to know me, I made sure that I did a really stellar job. And then about 6 months in, he was like, hey, we want to start a addiction services company and we want you to oversee it. And we feel like you're the right person to do it. And it's just kind of organically grown. But it's not common that people will, it's not common that the COO of a company will come into your LinkedIn and ask you for that. However, I will say it was a lot of hard legwork in early mornings and saying no to nothing as far as panels and advocacy and outreach and volunteering and doing thousands of hours of free work to kind of get to where I am today, that made that all happen the way that it did, I think. But it's not frequent that it happens like that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I worked in direct social services. So actually, I worked in direct social services even before I got my master's degree. I worked at the bachelor's level. Um, and when I graduated, I originally wanted to work in the refugee resettlement immigration field. And when I had graduated, unfortunately, there weren't many jobs in that area. And I actually did end up getting a job offer for an organization that I wanted to work at so bad. It was a national refugee resettlement organization. And unfortunately, it just didn't work out. And so I ended up doing direct service at the organization that I was working at prior to me getting my master's degree. And my supervisor at the time knew that I focused in macro practice. And she was like, I know this isn't exactly what you want to do, but you can work on some of these projects. You can work with our some of the advocacy committees that we work on. And so I got to go to Washington, D.C. to advocate for around food insecurity, around SNAP and food stamp benefits. I got to go to Albany and City Hall here in New York City to advocate around food insecurity. So I was able to build those skills, even though I was working in direct social services at the time. And that landed me my next job, which I was at for about 3 years at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, where I oversaw a consortium of stakeholders that was looking at how the Medicaid managed care transition was impacting the local community. And so in that role, I interacted with about 600 different stakeholders, hospital executives, the executives of the Medicaid managed care programs in New York City, behavioral health organizations, Medicaid recipients, peer specialists, anybody that was impacted by the Medicaid transition. That's who I was interacting with. So that was the network that I built over the course of 3 years. And so in that role, people got to know me. And one of the entities that I was interacting with a lot was the Coalition for Behavioral Health. And so when I had learned that one of my contacts there was leaving, I asked, well, what's going to happen with your role? And they said, oh, we're going to be hiring for it. And I was like, oh, interesting, And so that's when I transitioned into my current role at the Coalition for Behavioral Health as the Director of Policy and Advocacy. So it's, if somebody told me 5 years ago when I graduated from my MSW program, this is what I'd be doing now, I probably wouldn't believe them. But, kind of step by step, things change and morph and they become more clear, if that makes sense.
My belief is at the beginning of your career, you're going to have to hustle. I think that's probably true for most careers, but particularly for social work. And if you're going to be a macro social workers, the amount of jobs that are available for macro social workers is just very small, especially considered to students who are coming out of school after getting their degree in some sort of micro practice. That's certainly what my experience was. And to top that off, the macro jobs that you do find that are connected to the classes or the programs that you studied often want there to be some sort of prior experience in that field. And if you're just coming out of school and are sort of at the very beginning of your career, you may not have that experience. So, I mean, that's incredibly tough to get into, to start your career in a place where they're already looking for prior experience. Like I said, in the position I found, it was 15 hours a week initially when I began. And eventually I was able to build that into a full-time position. But I mean, I don't believe I'm going to be doing this type of work for the rest of my life either. So I'm always on the lookout for, I regularly update my resume when I can. I'm sort of looking at my job right now in sort of like 6-month stages, because I know like what the life of my grant looks like. And I know kind of like what the life of, you have a 6-month legislative session, then you have 6 months of sort of building towards the next legislative session, and then that goes for 6 more months. So you always need to be looking ahead and kind of anticipating sort of what will your job be like in a year from now, or maybe 6 months from now. And again, I've only been doing this for a few years now, so I'm still learning that as I go along. And again, I'm doing organizing work, and I went to school for policy practice. And then I noticed there were some questions there about getting your licensure. I'm an LMSW right now in Connecticut. That doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of like the work I do. It means literally nothing at all, except that I remember when I took the LMSW exam, I wish that I had taken more clinical classes when I was in school. The bulk of the questions that I got were clinical questions, and I was a macro social worker. Luckily, I passed the exam, and I'm never going to lose that. So I'll pay the Department of Public Health here in Connecticut $300 every year so I can maintain that, even though it means like little to nothing compared to the work that I do. But maybe at some point down the line, I would want to get my clinical licensure at some point. So you get the MSW here in Connecticut, then you have to get the LMSW before you can apply to take the exam to get your LCSW. So that, to me, that's all about keeping your options open, because you never know what direction you're going to go. And I think like Sarah and Precious, and I think Miriam talked about too, how they started off in sort of doing like clinical work and went to macro. You never know when you might go back in the other direction at some point later on in your life. And like Sarah says, she still does some micro stuff on the side too. So keeping your options open is, in like Alberto was saying earlier, being flexible, because you never know what kind of opportunities will open up and what direction your career might go in.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Gus had said. So it also depends on where you work. So when I worked at the New York City Department of Health, even though I was working in a macro capacity, my civil service job title required licensure. So even though I wasn't seeing clients or doing direct services, that job title required licensure. So sometimes you might need it. Government job titles and civil service job titles vary depending on the locality and the state. But sometimes even if you're working in a macro capacity, you might still need the licensure. And I had lots of colleagues that I worked with, and this was before New York State required licensure, that didn't get their licenses. Some of them were grandfathered in, some weren't, and then had to go back 5-10 years after graduate school and had to take the licensing exam to keep their positions. And so, when it's fresh in your head, it's there, I say, get it out of the way, and you never know when you're going to need it. Oh, also one more question. There was a question about working in consulting or banks or financial institutions. You can definitely make that pivot. I know a lot of people who have who have a master's in social work who work in healthcare consulting specifically. But when you do, you really have to justify why you are the most appropriate person for that role and what social work specifically brings that other professions do not, because you are in those other roles, you're going to be competing against other people who may have a master's in public health, a master's in public affairs, maybe a law degree, maybe an MBA. So you really need to distinguish yourself from the rest of those groups. Also, some corporations don't even know that MSWs do macro practice. So in your cover letter and in your resume, you might have to do a little bit of that education, because they might just say, oh, why is a social worker applying for this? You're going to have to really spell that out for them.
So I am going to try to answer all three questions. So the first one, how did you get your job? So like Sarah, I think it's just all encompassing of the entire conversation. I am going to close this curtain. I'm sorry. One second. Sorry, maybe a little darker.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay. My job did not exist. I am the first person in my position. What ended up happening was before this, when I was doing the neighborhood organizing, I took a job with my master's degree that was paying me $15 an hour. That was less than 40 hours a week. But it was really what I wanted to do. Like, neighborhood organizing was so dope to me that I just took the pay cut. And so what happened was the organization, I was fresh out of school, right? And so they were like, you got to write grants, And I was not bringing in the type of grants that is needed to sustain an organization. Like, I'd bring in like small $5,000, $10,000, maybe even $25,000 grants, but you can't sustain an organization on that. And so the organization was not able to keep me. But what I did was I had a conversation with one of our largest funders who, wanted to cultivate me like as an organizer. They really liked me. They didn't like the organization. And so as I was doing my work, I found another organization, the Racial Justice Coalition, that was a group. It wasn't an organization or a job. It was just a group of folks who were like, we need to start talking about race in Middletown. And, you know, I created this position. I got into that group. I was volunteering as I was still working and was like, yo, so let's create a position for somebody to run this group. And, you know, I think I may have found a funder. So I went to the funders and I said, you know, this is a thing, it's happening. I would love to run this group. If I wrote a proposal, would you all take it? And the ED was like, yes. And so I did. The second thing, I am not licensed. I did not get my LMSW. I am one of those folks who like, I don't see the point. I was in micro social work for about 6 or 7 years before I got into micro social work, and I don't see myself going back. Like, and so maybe I'm one of those folks who will just be unprepared 10 years from now, but it's not something that I am looking to do. I'm actually looking to, you know, further my education rather than getting the macro practice licensure. And so I did not see the point of it as an organizer to pursue that. So I don't have my my LMSW. And then the last one about contracting, I am a contractor. Like the work that I do is contracted because the Racial Justice Coalition is not an organization. So again, like I said, I had to create my position. I had to find a fiduciary for this group. I had to basically start this group. And so being flexible, being open, being creative, being innovative, like nobody thought to even say, let's, find some money and get, and that was me. You know what I'm saying? I was just like, I have to look out for myself and I love this work, but I'm not doing it for free because that's one thing that people will push social workers to do because they know that we care and we're empathetic and we're compassionate. So they think we're gonna work for free and I don't play that. So I was just like, we got to figure out a way for me to get paid for this. And so that innovation and that creativity, and those relationships more than anything else kind of helped me to get where I am.
So we've been getting such great questions, and a lot of you have already addressed them. It's hard to give, it's easy to give an answer if you want to be a clinician. Oh, you just get your LCSW. It's like, it's that easy, like to tell. But when it comes to a macro practitioner getting licensing, it really does depend. I mean, all of the above of what these panelists have said. So, if you picture yourself going into being a clinician or being an LCSW, or then get the LMSW just to have it so that you can actually go and become an LCSW, or maybe a particular position requires it. Some states have macro licensing. They have their own, Connecticut does not, but some states have their own licensing, their own macro licensing. You may want to look into that.
Yeah.
So Michigan does.
Yeah, Michigan
Thank
does.
you, Tamari. Thank you. Thank you. So yes. So consider those factors. Also, I don't want to miss this really good question. It was earlier in the chat, because a lot of schools of social work do not have these community organizing, policy practice, social administration. They don't have these concentrations. So there's a student who says that they don't have that specialization in macro. So there's just this generalist education. So what can they do to expand their skills if they want to go into a macro position after they graduate? Like, how do you do that if you're not, if you can't specialize in a certain macro practice field? How can you actually go into having a macro job? What can you do to build your skills?
I think I want to take this question first because it's exactly what I did, right? I didn't know there was a macro. I got into social work just knowing that there was a casework. And so it was through getting involved both in school and out of school, like join some campaigns, Go to some rallies, meet organizers, meet folks who are already working in those macro positions, network, build those relationships with folks who you want those kinds of positions. And so yes, you're getting a generalist degree, but my degree did not help me in the work that I'm doing. I will be all the way honest and say that, Alberto, and say that, like, when I was at the School of Social Work, we had to fight for a class about race. We had one class called Human Oppression, and that was the only place where we talked about how beautiful and how gorgeous and how everything Black people are, and we didn't. There was no class for that, and it hurt my soul. And so we, a whole bunch of us students of color, we organized, to get classes like that. And so my degree was not helpful, and except if you talk about those experiences where I, looked outside of that, and used what I was learning outside of that to build my own education.
Yeah, I would echo what Precious said. So in most states, there's a NASW chapter. So that's one way to get involved with advocacy. At least here in New York City, the schools of social work at Fordham, Columbia, NYU, Hunter, Adelphi, Wurzweiler, they all go up to Albany together with the NASW to advocate for a variety of social welfare policies that advance social work. Things like increasing tuition forgiveness for social work students, things like that. They usually go up in person every year. With COVID, things look a little bit differently, but so there's opportunities for you to get involved that way. I believe at every school of social work, you have a social welfare policy course you take. So that's, really, doing every read, if this is something you're really interested in and your school doesn't have a specialty in it, doing every reading in that class, talking to that professor to see how you can get involved in advocacy. I think there was a question about grant writing. That's another great way to get involved as well. And then also looking at specific internships. Is there an internship where you can work with a legislator or at an agency in a macro capacity rather than a direct service capacity, or start or build or run a campaign, and not necessarily like a candidate's political campaign, but even just an advocacy campaign. If you're working at a homeless shelter, or doing your internship at a homeless shelter, can you develop a campaign for a few months that addresses some of the issues that you're seeing in that specific shelter?
What would you all say are some additional resources that people can turn to? So if they want to be a macro practitioner, they may not have the skills and experience, they're trying to build it. Are there any resources that you could point them to? Any courses that they can take? Any?
The thing that I've used the most, and this is something that Hunter had us use, and I still use it today. I'm going to put it in the chat box. It's the community toolbox. It is an incredible resource. I'm not sure if others are familiar with this resource, but basically just like anything around community organizing, it has modules and PowerPoints and training and template documents that you can use when you're organizing or doing a campaign or finding volunteers. It is an excellent resource. I always go back to it. It's kind of like when I have a question about organizing, it's the first place I go to just to see, because it's got 99% of things.
I agree, Miriam. Thank you for putting the website in the chat box. I definitely agree.
I think you just always have to be, as a macro social worker. There are a lot of students that I can remember that were sort of in micro concentrations, and they were not particularly interested in doing a lot of the extracurricular work when I was in school. You didn't see a lot of them show up to events that the school would put on. They weren't necessarily involved in a lot of this, just the extra stuff that you had opportunities to. So as a macro student, you take advantage of those. I was part of a new student organization that did not exist, and we got to put that together. And for a while, that was on my resume. So you have to be hustle. You have to hustle and be creative. I mentioned earlier, in Connecticut, there's a handful of elected officials that are social workers that are MSWs. And if you find opportunities to work with them when they have campaigns going on, so you can go out and do door knocking with them. That gives you an opportunity to get FaceTime with them, and you never know what might open up with that down the line, whether it's working in their office or potentially using them as an ally in some sort of campaign that you're working on. So you have to be entrepreneurial. You have to find opportunities where you are, because I think for a lot of micro students, and again, I saw this, like they had very defined career paths in front of them where they were going to graduate, they were going to get their MSW, they were going to go into someplace where they could get 2 years of getting all their supervision hours, and they get their LCSW, and then they're going into private practice or some sort of other setting, and they have their entire career mapped out in front of them. That doesn't exist for macro social workers the same way. So like Precious did, it sounds like all of us are doing right now. You have to do it for yourself, which is exciting in some ways for people that are really into that. I mean, it can be intimidating because you don't know necessarily what the next 20 years of your life are going to look like, but I think that actually makes it more interesting.
So I got this question. It's unusual because, I mean, we have our MSWs, but think about like as an undergraduate student, if you're an undergraduate student and you want to pursue macro practice, a macro career, do you think there are specific courses or subjects people should be taking or people should be exploring in their undergraduate? What are your suggestions?
Yeah, so I was a political science major in undergrad, and that's like really very similar to macro practice. Actually, kind of the way I got into social work was not like when I was in undergrad, I was not like freshman year of college, I'm definitely going to be a social worker. I actually ended up getting my federal work study job was in the School of Social Work. And that's how I learned about social work, by working in the field office, doing student paperwork for their field placements. And this was back when a lot of it wasn't computerized. So I was hand filing everything. And that's how I learned about social work. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and that's why I ended up being a political science major. And life took me in another direction. And so, and to be honest, it's kind of full circle, because the stuff that I wanted to do when I thought I wanted to be a lawyer is actually all the stuff I do today with a social work degree, is advocating for communities around increasing access to healthcare and reading legislation and regulations and interacting with legislators.
Well, our time is almost done. We're wrapping up regretfully, but you all foresaw the self-care question. So to end this, what do you do to promote self-care? Because I mean, it's something that is not really talked about as often as, oh, Sarah's ready. It's not something that's brought up a lot in school. So I know when I was educated, self-care wasn't like, I had to burn myself out numerous times in school. So what do you do to promote self-care and just wind down? Sarah.
It's been a long path. It's still a work in progress. And I always say this when I speak to students, like they talk a lot about self-care in school, and I always thought that it only happened to weak people until it happened to me. And I literally met in school, and I'm like, yeah, like that's for weak people. That will not occur with me. But lo and behold, when you're driving to work crying every day, it happens to you, right? And it's the nature of our work, where I feel like those of us who do go into social work, usually, you hope, are really good people with big hearts who want to meaningfully change their communities and systems and help people. And as Precious had indicated, people will try and get us to work for free. People will try all different types of things. But I think for me, self-care, I've learned, is all about like the biopsychosocial stuff, right? So I need to sleep. If I'm not sleeping an adequate amount, all bets are off. If I'm not eating healthy and fueling my body, all bets are off. If I'm not spending time with the people that nourish and feed my soul, it is not good for me. My phone has to go off after a certain time. Between 9:30 and 6 a.m., my phone goes straight to voicemail. And unless you're on a very special small list, it is not getting pushed through. And I'm very fiercely protective of that. Going to the gym, depending on work chaos, it could be 2 days a week, it could be 6 days a week. It depends on how chaotic my life is. But really prioritizing the handful of things that make me happy. And during COVID, that's never been more important than ever. Trying to keep my mind and body strong, but also learning how to set boundaries and to say no, and to say no without a qualifier or an exclamation, and to kind of learn how to do that well. But self-care is a never-ending learning endeavor for me, and I'm sure probably everyone else on this panel and everyone on this Zoom call. It's a process, but I think doing the things you love is really important.
Yeah, I agree with Sarah. For me, everything Sarah said, I agree with. I've been through that, crying on the way to work, not on the subway, not driving in New York City. I've definitely been there, have burnt out full on. I think for me, especially now with COVID and the election just ending, being really mindful of what I'm consuming, both in my body, by what I'm eating and what I'm doing, but also what I'm seeing, what I'm listening to, and what I'm hearing. And so just little things like in the morning, listening to positive music that puts me in a good mood has really helped. Or just 1 minute of meditation, just noticing my breath going in and out is just really helpful to give myself that pause that I need just to relax and kind of unwind a little bit, and kind of thinking about, I also have to get sleep too. If I don't get 8 hours of sleep, and I am just a wreck. And so just making sure throughout the day, am I doing everything I can to set myself up for good sleep tonight? Not drinking caffeine after a certain period of time, eating, not eating too close before bed, because I know that makes it very difficult for me to fall asleep. So just thinking about those things and knowing what my boundaries are.
Yeah, I don't want to be repetitive with what with Mariam and Sarah just said. I think they're totally on point. As far as your work goes, as far as like when we do work, I mean, this is part of our strategy, but there's a personal fulfillment too, is celebrate victories when you can. When we do events, we usually have some sort of reflective moment after it, and then we try to celebrate in some way. COVID makes that extremely difficult, but at the end of the week, we have typically in my organization, we get together and we might have like an office happy hour, which might be over Zoom. But so find moments, especially in like the campaign work we do. It's like heavy stuff. It's like, ending solitary confinement and protecting incarcerated people from COVID-19 and, reentry issues. And like this stuff is really tough sometimes. So when you have opportunities to celebrate a win, when you have opportunities to keep things light and be self-deprecating and have fun in the work that you do, you need to take full advantage of those, and you really need to lift those up and don't dismiss, because it's where, you want to focus on like some heavy, oppressive topic. And then when something light and fluffy comes along, it's really easy to just kind of push that to the side and say, we need to get back to like the serious stuff. So when there are chances to celebrate and have a good time, you really need to like take the time to bask in those and really enjoy them, especially with the people you work with.
Last but not least, Precious.
So for me, self-care, it started as like, oh, I'm gonna do the things that make me happy. And then I never found time for them, right? So they're there, but never found time for them. So for me, self-care became a mind shift change. So I said, ask the question of like, what does liberation look like for me? I can't be a Black woman working in liberation work, seeing my folks dying all the time, and like not knowing what liberation feels like, what it looks like, what it tastes like, what it smells like. And so I've done, I'm doing, like Sarah said, constantly, I am doing the work of shifting my mind mindset to say, like, this is what my liberation looks like. It looks like me not answering this email, even though this person sounds like they need immediate answers. This looks like, you know, having my jam sessions before I go to bed. So this looks like getting off the Zoom call before it's over, if I need to. This looks like, you know, so it's disrupting the things that, you know, society tells me I need to do for the things that my liberation tells me that I need to do. And so it's really been a mind shift change for me.
Well, that was such a great conversation and dialogue. You shared so many great tips and tricks and advice for students and practitioners alike. I just want to thank Sarah, Precious, Miriam, and Gus so much for their wonderful insights and sharing of stories and experience. I really hope that you all got a sense of what being a macro practitioner is and what it entails. I hope that you'll keep on developing your macro skills using some of the tips and advice that you got through this workshop. I hope that you'll still continue to come to our webinars. We're having another one in March, Day in the Life of a Macro Practitioner. So keep a lookout for that in March during Social Work Month next year. But please keep in tune with what MSWSN is doing. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. The bios that you received via email have the emails of all the panelists, so feel free to reach out to them and feel free to reach out to our network. Thank you so much. This is a great way to end the week. And again, I really want to thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much. I'm familiar with all your work, so I wasn't surprised. You did such a really wonderful job. Thank you. And I really want to thank everyone for coming and being here. Thank you. You could do the clap too, the other clap. I'll do the other clap. There's the other clap. Thank you so much.
Alberto, can you save the chat before?
Yeah. I'm gonna do that.
That I want to take for myself in there.
Yeah, no, I will save it right now. I will save it and I will send it to all of you. And I will send, you'll get the recording, you'll get all of that. So.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. You all are so wonderful. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving.
Take care.
Yeah.
Have a great Thanksgiving.
Thanks for joining, Goku. You're always here. It's good seeing you. Yeah.
Okay, they're starting to leave. Let me, I'll just remove, bye-bye. Oh, you know what? I have to stop the recording too. That would help. Let me stop it.